Okay, so if I could just pick up from where we left, we've just talked about appearance being important, and pretty much that's how we really kind of, define species at the moment. If I showed you, like I said, a plant, you would tell me it's a plant. And this all kind of links into, okay, that links into, the appearance and what we already know about species. We can go down to a cellular level, and that's how we kind of, classify them into kingdoms. And we could go even further than that. I will talk about that when we actually look at how we can classify them based on their DNA. Okay, I don't know why it's doing this. Okay, let me try and sort this out. Yes. Right, so what is a species continued? Okay, so the next definition of a species then is whether it can produce fertile offspring. Okay, and so that kind of links into our definition from A level. You get two animals together, if they can reproduce and produce fertile offspring, we call them a species. Now, that's fine, and it works pretty much 99% of the time, but the problems that we can face with this is literally that some animals are actually of the same species, but they just don't live in the same area. Okay, so we might have cats that live on the continent of Africa, cats that live on the continent of Asia, and because they're not in close proximity to each other, they're unable to mate and produce fertile offspring. Okay, and so I might actually end up classifying them as a different species, whereas in fact they are of the same species. Okay, so not all animals live in the same area. Okay, and we saw this with the Galapagos Islands and the finches. So we have finches, they're slightly different, they have different variations, and they live on different islands, okay, and so through natural selection they've got different ways in which they've actually adapted to their environment, but technically some of those could actually produce fertile offspring if they came into contact with each other, okay. The other one problem we have is that we can actually look at a species and like I say, oh look at this is a lion, okay, we all know what a lion looks like, I'm not going to draw a lion because you'll laugh, and I could introduce it to a tiger. Okay, and we can produce a fertile species. Okay, so even though they don't live in the same area, they don't look that alike. We can say yes, they're cats, but they don't look identical. But they do produce fertile offspring in quite a few of the cases. Okay, so that's the problem of using fertile offspring as a way of defining a group. And so literally now the definition, instead of, species that can get together and produce fertile offspring is our definition that we used to know, what we can do is we can kind of redefine that. And so how we redefine it now is a species can be a group of organisms. Okay, so learn it. A group of organisms in which genes can flow between individuals. Okay, so if you have the correct number of chromosomes, you can pass on genes, and so genes can flow between individuals. Okay, so that's a new, a modification of the old definition. And so there are three other models, and these are not so great. Okay, so we talked about it briefly. We said about the ecological niche. Okay, or the ecological species model, and that's literally that a species occupies a particular niche, and so that niche is what we call, or makes it a particular species. So niche is quite a difficult thing to define, but it's literally the role an organism has in its environment. So it can be, where does it live? Okay, what does it eat? What time of day does it come out? Was it night time? All of these kind of things link into the niche. And so remember we talked about birds which lived on the rock, the cliff faces near the sea, or above the sea. And so we realised that different birds could live together if they were living in separate sections. So some of them were living on the very wide parts of the cliff, and some of them were living in the very narrow parts. What they were eating was different, because some of them were kind of just skimming along the surface and eating the fish that were along the surface. Some of them actually dove right into the water, and they were kind of like feeding off fish that were at the bottom. And also time of day. Okay, well in this case they both were actually hunting at the same day, or same time of day. So that's how we could actually talk about whether it's a particular species or not. So we might have two different types of mice that live in a particular region. We could say, oh, they are of the same species, but then on close observation we realise that this one's eating berries and this one's eating nuts, and this one comes out in the day and this one comes out at night. And so closely observing them, we can actually realise that they are slightly different, and so we can classify them as a different species. Okay, and that would be an ecological species. Okay, the next one then is mate recognition. Okay, the mate recognition model. And so, if a particular male recognises a female and they're able to mate, then they must be of the same species. And so, generally that's obviously relatively straightforward, and it kind of helps us a lot, especially when a male and a female are different. They appear different. So if you think about the peacock, the male peacock is the beautiful bird with the very, very brightly coloured feathers, and if you actually looked at the female, she doesn't look anything like the male. She's very plain. She's very brown feathers, nothing really much to look at. But the reason we know they're obviously species is because they recognise each other. They're able to mate, and they're able to produce fertile species. Okay, so the only problem we have with that though is mate recognition. You think, okay, these two are mates, they recognise each other, but then we could have the horse and a donkey. We've got that option. Okay, they're different species and yet they're still able to mate, and then we go back to the idea of the lion and the tiger. Okay, so that's the problem with mate recognition model. The final one that we have to talk about is the genetic species model, and so we will talk about this in more detail later, and literally the kind of techniques we use to determine whether it's a type of species or not. And this is the use of obviously DNA and RNA, and obviously using this we can then look at the type of proteins present within a particular species, and this is pretty much the way forward with this. It used to be a lot more difficult because it used to be very expensive to do, but now with new techniques it's becoming a lot easier to actually look at sections of DNA. It doesn't have to be the whole genome of the organism. We can look at different sections, or we can have a look for particular proteins which are present and whether there's any kind of mutations within those proteins, because that's another way that we can kind of like then map out to see how closely related certain species are. Okay, so this is the second part now of the same video. I'm going to produce one more and then I'll go on to the next lesson. Okay, so now remember, it's really important that you're going back over these notes, you're reading through the book yourself. There are questions in the textbook to check your knowledge, and I will then give you some exam questions.